We have got a quorum, and it's already past the starting time, so let's get started. Item number 1, confirmation of minutes. Members are invited to confirm minutes of the meeting held on the 30th of January 2013. That is LC paper CP 1918/1213. So far, the Secretariat hasn't received any proposed amendments. So may I take it that the minutes can be confirmed now, if there's no objection? Thank you. Items for discussion at the next meeting. Please refer to CB 1919/1213. The next meeting will be held on the 30th of May, Thursday, at 8:30 a.m. There are 2 proposed items, matters of concern to members. First, measures to increase land supply for housing development. Second, matters related to subdivided units. So members, do we agree? Okay, so we agree to put these 2 items on the agenda. Item number 3. Let's ask the officials to join us.
Let's
give them a minute to settle down.
I'd
like to welcome Mr. Pascott, Permanent Secretary from the Transport and Housing Bureau, Ms. Agnes Wong, Deputy Secretary, Mr. Anson Light, Assistant Director. We're now on agenda item number 3, the Housing Authority's quota and points system for non-elderly one-person applicants for public rental housing. LC paper number CB1 919/1213/02. This is a paper from the administration in respect of the Housing Authority's quota and point system for non-elderly one-person applicants for public rental housing. I'd like to welcome the administration's representatives. So over to the officials for a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. Who will be doing this?
Just to set the scene, we are still at that discussion stage in the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee. So the papers that we're producing for members represent the similar papers that we're producing for the members for their consideration and discussion. Obviously, what we're keen to hear is members' views on this, which will then be reflected back to the steering committee. Today, we have 2 papers. The first one is on the quota and point system. It's the current policy of the government and the Housing Authority to accord priority to general applicants, including family applicants and elderly applicants, over non-elderly one-person applicants in the allocation of public rental housing units. Towards this end, the quota and point system was introduced to rationalise and reprioritise the allocation of public rental housing to non-elderly one-person applicants. Recently, the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee has reviewed the overall housing situation of the waiting list applicants, including those non-elderly one-person applicants. Taking into consideration limited public rental housing resources, the overall housing situation, and the lengthening waiting list, the Steering Committee has made a few suggestions and recommendations on the possible enhancements to the quota and point system. The intention is that the public will be consulted on these proposals when the public consultation document on the long-term housing strategy is released. And thereafter, the proposals will be referred to the Housing Authority for them to consider. And let me stress, it is for the Housing Authority to take the final decision on any modification to the quota and point system. As I said before, we're keen to ensure that members' views are also taken into account at this stage. I'd like to invite the Principal Assistant Director, Anson Lai, to make a short PowerPoint presentation to brief members on the operation of the QPS as it is today, as well as the latest Steering Committee considerations and discussion on this matter. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
唔該曬主席嘅。
Over to you, Mr. Lai. Thank you, Chairman. Let me say something about the operation of the quota and point system and the LTHS steering committee's discussion on the matter. First, the QPS. It was introduced in September 2005 by the HA to accord priority accorded to other applicants over non-elderly one-person applicants. Under this system, the annual quota for non-elderly one-person applicants is set at 8% of the total number of PRH flats, which is also capped at a ceiling of 2,000 units. As for the point system, under this system, there are three factors that would determine the scores they would get. The age when they submit the application, whether they are also a PRH tenant, and also the waiting time. The average waiting time of 3 years applicable to general applicants do not apply to non-elderly one-person applicants. Here are some figures. At the end of last year, on the general waiting list, we have 115,300 applicants. As for those under QPS, there were 106,900 applicants. Compared with the situation at the end of December 2011, for general applicants as well as non-elderly one-person applicants, there have been increases of 20% and 34% respectively. At the end of last year, 106,000 QPS, those QPS applicants, some 67% or 71,500 who were aged 35 or below. Every year, we also compile some statistics on the applicants. In the first quarter of 2012, of those who are under 35 years of age, those who are tertiary educated or above accounted for 47%, and 34% of them were students when they applied. 33% were PRH talents when they applied. As for those who are over 35, only 7% of them had tertiary education or above. The steering committee is aware of the characteristic of these applicants, and in view of the tight supply of PRH and also the total situation with allocation and the number of applicants increasing, the steering committee reaffirmed that we should accord priority to families and elderly applicants. The steering committee is also of the view that the quota of 2,000 for non-elderly one-person applicants per annum should be maintained. However, the steering committee is aware that for some of the non-elderly one-person applicants, they do not have the necessary ability to move upward socially, and therefore they are unable to improve their housing conditions on themselves, so they should be given some priority. Although in the long term, the waiting time criterion should be applied to these who are non-elderly single person applicants should also be covered. But since housing supply is tight, this should be left for the longer term when we are able to do so. At the same time, we should consider doing this in phases. That is to say, to extend the waiting time target to those between 45 and 55, and then gradually cover other age groups all the way to those who are over 35. And also, as a first step, the steering committee thinks that the higher scores should be given to those who are over 35 in this category, so that they will be given a higher chance to get allocation. Apart from the age, the steering committee thinks that it's worthwhile to consider other conditions of the applicant in setting the allocation criteria. The steering committee also proposes that the regular assessment of income and assets of those who are already on the waiting list should be carried out, so as to eliminate those who are no longer eligible. Today we're here to invite members to note the quota and point system and also the discussion that the steering committee has had so far. As the Permanent Secretary has said, there will be a consultation paper on the LTHS, and at that point public views will be solicited on the QPS. At the end of the day, all the views and recommendations will be referred back to the HA for final decision. Thank you, Mr. Lai. As we are told that the views expressed today by members will be taken back to the steering committee and also maybe to the housing authority for consideration. So I'm going to ask our clerk to record members' views in greater detail. And of course, if the Permanent Secretary can respond immediately to some of our issues, please do so. And if not, when you refer those views to the HA, I would request that they give us their response to our views. For example, whether they agreed or disagree with our views. I'll appreciate their response. We hope to get some response to our views, and that will be very much appreciated.
報咗名
We have now 鍾樹根、梁子祥、胡志偉、李卓人、郭偉強、麥美娟。So we'll set 4 minutes for Q&A. Well, I might sound disrespectful. If we are called the Long-Term Housing Strategy Subcommittee, then we might as well be called the ad hoc committee. We just solving problems as they occur. I'm just expressing my views. Well, regarding your criticism of the composition of the subcommittee, as chairman of the subcommittee, the composition of the subcommittee, allow me to speak, it's according to the housing panel, where a member had made an offer or a proposition to set up the subcommittee on long-term housing strategy, and our subcommittee will urge and monitor the government's review of long-term housing strategy. So we would encourage you to raise questions. Well, whether we are able to solve problems as they occur, we're trying our best, but we're not here to resolve problems. I'm just expressing I'll give you back your time. If you're not being disrespectful, I'm just convening the meeting. Well, whether we are long-term or not, do we need our own experts to research the problem? Because this delves upon population policy. You want to listen to feedback, you want to do complex calculations, you want to add points here and deduct points there and put them on the waiting list. Are you aware of the demand in the coming 10 years for public housing? What about the growth of elderly? Well, take our cohort, for example. We are almost eligible. Our children won't look after us in our old age. These baby boomers will retire soon. We're talking about millions of retiring baby boomers. There was also a senior official, permanent secretary. He was saying that he won't need to live in a few thousand feet apartment. He'll just need a small apartment. Even senior officials think so. So the general public, when they age, the need for single person units will be very large. So the 1 or 2 person units, have you considered the supply? Could you spend some money to do some research, recruit or engage some scholars and look at the coming 10, 20 years population change and what kind of demands they will have. Well, it's not your problem if we can't solve all problems. It might be the previous administration's problems. Even subdivided flats in factories or temporary housing, this kind of problem has to be resolved. You can't just crunch the numbers and have them queue in a waiting list. Well, the housing authority needs to look into this. I grew up in Lam-Tin Estate. My neighbor was Andy Lau. But I'm concerned when I age, how will my neighbors and myself age in society? You're saying you need to listen to the public opinion and then you'll go and consider that. Well, why don't you take the initiative and do some studies as government? You are receiving a high salary. You shouldn't be the subject of a filibuster motion to reduce salaries. Yes, could you have a brief response?
I think there's a few things I need to pick up on here. We're looking at the housing issue. Of course, there are other parts of government that are looking at population issues in parallel, and we're tapping into their research, their information gathering, and making sure that we take into account those issues. But you must understand, ongoing exercises to deal with immediate problems in housing, we're dealing with those on a daily basis through the Housing Authority, through the Development Bureau, the Transport and Housing Bureau. This exercise is a long-term housing strategy. It's looking, what do we need to do in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years to be able to satisfy those demands at that time? That's a different objective. We've got to do that as well as do the immediate exercise to deal with the immediate problems. So we are doing research. For example, we've commissioned research to look at subdivided units. We need to determine size, place, location, number, etc. That research, as I think members are aware, we'll be briefing members on at the next meeting. So that's already been commissioned. Other people are commissioning exercises to look at the population development, and we're taking that into account. The other issue that I think I want to pick up on is that aging is one of the issues that this committee is looking at. What are the elderly housing requirements in the future? But we're also looking at things like young housing. What are the young housing requirements in future? What are the numbers going to be? At the same time as this exercise, the long-term exercise is going on, within the department and within the Housing Authority, we do an annual exercise to look at the demand for the next 5-year period for the delivery of those projects that we're working on now. And in that context, we look at the flat mix, the size of flats, how many 1P, 2P, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom flats we should be delivering, anticipating the demand in 5 years' time, because that's the lead time that we build to. So every decision we make today has a delivery in 5 or 6 years' time. So that this is a matrix. It's not just one thing, and you can take it away from the overall picture. What we're talking about here is the long term, and that's why we're talking about these issues as a long-term issue.
I mentioned that I would add time taken away from my response, but I would like to remind everybody that Q&A, 4 minutes each, and I will have to exercise strict time control next Leung Ji-chang. I quite agree with Mr. Zhong Shugan on housing strategy needing a comprehensive study. We can't just look at it from one perspective. But of course today's topic is non-elderly single applicants. So from the government data, I can pick up some information. 33% of applicants are from PRH residents. They don't want to live with their parents. They want to be independent, but they can't afford private housing, and they want to continue to live in PRH. So does that indicate the wealth policy and other factors have an influence, and it leads to people, young applicants, applying for public rental housing. So we have so many residents in PRH, and yet they still want to apply for single-person units. So it indicates that some policies are creating that incentive. Second, we see that almost half of the applicants are tertiary educated. Well, just now there was an introduction about social mobility being reduced. So even though they're in the queue, they might have a raise in income, but they still, and then they won't be eligible. Why do we have so many tertiary applicants applying for public housing? Is it that the tertiary educated people have a low income, that they are under the threshold for public rental housing income tests? I think just now Mr. Zhong Shugan highlighted the need for research, so perhaps I'll allow the time for a response. And just now the Secretary said that it takes 5 years to build housing, so to build a single person unit in your future plan, the ratio of single person units, is it the same, or are you aware that 50% of applicants are applying for single units? So will you increase the number of single person units? Because we see there's a limited supply.
Let me deal with the issues in order. In terms of the impact of policy, existing policies such as the well-off tenant policy, I think it's not actually that easy to make a direct relationship. There are many, many reasons why people apply. One of the reasons we know is that as part of the induction at some universities, students are told you may as well apply because there's nothing to lose by applying through the quota and point system. That, we know, has had an impact on the number of people applying. It's a very odd thinking, because in reality, any student who's at a tertiary institution should expect to have an income well above that which would require them to be into public rental housing. So that's one of the issues that we need to look at. In terms of the social mobility being reduced, I don't believe that's true. I think it's just part of what they're told to do, so they do it. I think social mobility is still there for those tertiary institutions students, and I don't think that's related to the reason they're applying. The second question really relates to the change in ratio. The answer is yes, we do review that on an annual basis. We do look at it, but I must stress the priority is given to family applicants and elderly applicants. Younger singleton applicants, we only have 2,000 per annum within the quota, so we always have that number of single units.
Mr. Wu Jiwai. This paper seeks our input, and I wish to make 2 points. The administration says the non-elderly single-person applicant, we have to consider they should be better off and they should not be encouraged to queue in the single-person applicant. But I just want to point out, society is changing. A lot of people choose to be single. So if you are to address these non-elderly single applicants, there might be a big change in their income and assets, and you should shorten their review period. For family, you might review them every 10 years, but for these non-elderly single applicants, the income should be reviewed over a shorter period. The second question, the paper says the latest position at the end of 2012 there were 115,300 general applications and 106,900 were non-elderly one-person applicants. Well, it seems quite impressive. But can you tell me the number of successful applications? How many were successful? We need to grasp the real situation. And how many of these cases, by the time their case was reviewed, they were still eligible? And third, the whole housing supply is 15,000 per year, and Mr. Leung Ji-xiang asked, what is the composition, the breakdown? Because if we just look at the figures, you're saying that family or elderly applicants, there's some 9,000 units available for them. So, in light of the change in applicant structure, have you adjusted your housing supply such that there can be an effective dealing with this large number on the waiting list?
To answer the last question, yes, as I say, we review the flat supply on an annual basis. We take into account the demand within each of the different eligible categories, and we modify it. For example, last year we've slightly increased the number of slightly larger flats because we know that the number of families, the large families, 5, 6, 7 people families, have been tending to wait longer, so we've had to adjust the numbers. At the same time, as I said in reply to the earlier question, for singleton applicants coming through the quota and point system, there's only 2,000 places every year, so that's that number we have. I also need to clarify, the supply is a mix of new 15,000 new units plus the number of units that we can recycle from our existing stock, and that roughly estimates another 7,000 or 8,000. So the total supply is around 22 to 23,000. And within that, of course, from the existing stock, we have large and small flats. So every year we have a huge mix of different sized flats. On the question of the review of income and asset limits, that's the 10-year review takes place for people who are already in public rental housing. People who are on the quota and point system list are not reviewed until they become eligible for allocation of a unit, and that depends on how long they're on the list.
所以頭先我想問個問題，即係唔好意思，佢未答我就係即係。
Question was not answered.
Okay.
Maybe you should wait for the second round. I can't help it, and hope everyone will be succinct. It's 4 minutes per member. Mr. Lee again. Mr. Next, all right, Mr. Kwok-hing. Some members have referred to the QPS as a piecemeal solution. But as I see it, this QPS is a system where no solution is attempted. If we look at the more than 100,000 applicants, non-elderly one-person applicants, according to the department, some 70% of them are tertiary educated. But can you guarantee high income if they are tertiary educated? You cannot equate education with income nowadays. So why are you employing such an excuse to exclude them? This system is just a nominal system. It just gives you false hope. You are not going to get any PRH. Young people, young applicants are bound to be screened out sooner or later. So how can these young applicants have hopes for our future? If they are already PRH tenants, they have negative points for the first 10 years of waiting. And that is, they should only consider getting married when they are 28. You also have the effect of deferring marriage of young PRH tenants. And also there's also an imposed well-off tenant status. If I get married and I'm not allowed to move out, or I can't move out, then I have to live with my parents, and the household as a whole will become a well-off tenant. But they cannot afford rent in the private sector. So if you want to help them, please take a look again, because in the last term of government, you did not do sufficient, so you must do some catch-up. You cannot say families always get priorities, but you cannot ignore one-person applicants, where more and more single people is going to rise forever. How come you can ignore their housing needs?
I don't think that the long-term housing strategy is trying to ignore the housing needs. Indeed, the reason that they focused on this particular issue is that they think that it needs to be addressed. They've come up with a series of recommendations, including introducing progressively the 3-year waiting time for younger people, looking at exactly what their income level is to make sure that people are not on the list that shouldn't be on the list, and various other measures. But I agree with you one thing. It is not an easy thing to deal with, because you've got to also bear in mind that in addition to the quota and point system, we have 115,000 families waiting on the waiting list. They also have their needs. The other reality about young people is that their circumstances change really very rapidly. We know that a young person's potential to advance themselves, to get better income, etc., is much, much higher than the older single applicants. We know from our own research that over 35, people who don't have tertiary education, they're not going to make much more out of their lives. That's where we should be focusing our attention. People at younger ages, 20, 25, they have the potential. They should be looking to more than public housing. And I think it's not unreasonable in a rational system of allocating limited resources to give the priority where it needs to go.
Mr. Lee Chia-yan, I find it strange that the steering committee of LTHS has not got anything arising from their work. Mr. Lee, you were not here when they told us that they are going to work out something. Okay. Well, they have considered certain factors according to the paper. Yes, their work has not been completed. For example, if you look at paragraph or PowerPoint number 5, members agree that the quota of 2,000 should be maintained. So that's a conclusion. And now they are going to listen to views, and they haven't completed their examination. So why do they have this conclusion? And also they are talking about considering relaxation for those over 35, but not those under 35. So are you saying that those under 35 have no housing needs? Is this the position taken by the steering committee? And that we should just ignore those under 35. Of course, those who are under 35 have housing needs, but you may think that some of these are tertiary educated, some are already PRH tenants. No matter what, you should not say that they have no housing needs because of their age. The biggest problem is that you simply assume that young people have no housing needs. Some of them are not PRH tenants. They may live in cubicles. What about them? Do you think that they have no housing needs? So my question is, why is it that the steering committee is proposing no change, a quota of 2,000, and also ignoring those under 35? So what's all these about? Many young people are on the waiting list. They just want to have a roof over their head. Don't assume that they have no problem or they have no housing needs. Don't discriminate against young people. Don't discriminate against those under 35.
Mr. Chairman, I really don't think the steering committee takes the view that people under 25, under 35, under 45 don't have housing needs. The mere fact that they're applying through the quota and point system already indicates they have housing needs. The issue, unfortunately, is that there are limited housing resources. And in a limited housing resource situation, you have to somehow prioritise the allocation of units in accordance with something that is transparent and fair so that everybody knows exactly where they stand. In order to do that, you have to come up with a system. The system that's been devised and has been in place for over 7 years now has been that we give priority first to the elderly, second to family groups, and third to singletons. Within the singletons, again, there's another hierarchy. Older singletons have the priority over younger singletons. That does not mean to say that anyone in the government or in the steering committee considers that these people do not have housing needs. So that's one thing we must be absolutely clear about. We recognise there is need. What we need to do, and this is already part of the objective, is increase the overall supply of housing so that we have more to be able to accommodate more people on the waiting list. Because the objective must be to reduce the waiting list as a whole. Not whether it's a family or an individual, you want to reduce all of the waiting list. And the only way you can do that is by increasing the number.
But if you keep the quota at 2,000, how can you reduce the number of singleton applicants? You're not going to change the quota of 2,000. Unless you increase the quota by another 2,000, you're not going to reduce the waiting list. You are discriminating against those under 35. Well, since you are consulting people, why do you have this conclusion of maintaining 2,000?
As the number of units that are available through the supply increases, then you can review the proportion that's given to each category. But at the moment, as members are well aware, the 15,000 is all we're able to produce for the next 4 or 5 years. Once that number goes up to 20,000 or more than 20,000, plus the HOS coming in, then you look at that again. But their conclusion is, in the current state, that seems the reasonable number.
But in the long run, they all get old. Miss Alice Mack. Well, Permanent Secretary, you should shoulder the biggest responsibility for the problem we are talking about. Why do we have a shortage of supply? You talk about limited housing resources. Why are we in such a situation? You have been the Permanent Secretary for so long, and you have ignored the problems. When we talk about this situation with non-elderly one-person applicants, it's not a new problem. You have been Permanent Secretary for years, and you have failed to address the problem. So now we have the steering committee, and you say there are only 15,000 units, and you can afford to give them 2,000. So we are in a dilemma. We know that on the waiting list that there are those who are over 35 who need a PRH urgently, but at the same time there are non-elderly one-person applicants who equally need PRH units. If we discuss with you the QPS, then I have to treat some applicants differently, but they both have housing needs, and we are discussing which goods should be sacrificed. And now the CE wants to expedite the process, and even with your able leadership, you can only shorten the waiting time or the lead time by a few months. So I think you are responsible for this situation we are in. Second, for the Quota 2000, you said when we have more in the future, there will be more PRH units to allocate, and then you can review the quota. But my question is, when you do the planning, please don't repeat past mistakes. Can you tell us that when you ask or when you look for a long-term solution, do you have a timetable as to when you can shorten the queue for non-elderly one-person applicants, and what will be the waiting time for them in the future?
The dilemma I face as the Permanent Secretary and Director of Housing is I don't control the land supply. I can build on every site I'm given, and I'm taking sites that, frankly, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have taken. But I have to respond with the land that I'm given. That's the reality I face. If I can get more land, I can build more. I have the resources to do that. At the moment, for example, in 2 years' time, we'd be building 20,000 in 1 year. So I can achieve the numbers if I have the land. That's the first reality I have to face. In terms of the dilemma, I think you're absolutely right. It is a dilemma facing the community as to how we allocate the resources that we have. I can't create out of nothing additional housing. It takes time. The government has committed to increase the total land supply for housing to 20,000 per annum for public rental housing, plus an additional 5,000 on top of that for a home ownership scheme, plus 20,000 equivalent in the private sector. Once those sort of numbers start to kick in, then there will be much more choice available to the community for the allocation of units. And that's when, I think, we'll be looking at a significant decrease in the number of people on the waiting list. But until we do that, we're stuck with the reality, because it takes 5 years from getting a piece of land ready for development to completing that development. We've reduced it as much as we possibly can. I don't want to take up your time, but there are many devices that we've used to reduce that time, but it still takes 5 years.
Mr. Raymond Wong, I think we all know the crux of the matter. You want to build more PRH units so that we can solve the problems. We're just telling people that your mom is a lady, and the problem doesn't rest with us, but with you. You are the policy, you're from the Policy Bureau. Your secretary is knowledgeable about housing matters. He's been a HA member for years. And the CE is also very knowledgeable about the housing and property. And you are a very able technocrat. You know everything inside out. I'm not going to oppose the recommendation of the steering committee. There are solutions to our problems, but everything boils down to supply. If we look at paragraph number 8, the average waiting time is about 3 years. The average waiting time target should be extended to the non-elderly one-person applicants over a certain age under a phased approach, starting, say, from the age of 45 or 55 and progressively moving it down to 35. Well, this is agreeable. It's just an improvement to the existing system, but you're just talking about it. Without PRH units, you cannot really implement it. For those who are over 35, their housing needs are by no means lower than those in other categories. They don't have the means or the ability to improve the situation themselves. It's a vicious cycle, and the root problem is the shortage of supply.
So the steering committee's recommendations, if they are feasible and they are acceptable, but the question is, there's still insufficient housing. So when we discuss this, we can't just look at the superficial measures. This is called a long-term housing strategy. How long-term are we? What we have in front of us is already insurmountable. So these meetings are talk shops. Even the steering committee hopes that when resources are more abundant, they can resolve it in phases. They can resolve the problem in phases. So this is just empty talk here. Even in paragraph 9, I don't object to their recommendation. It says that single applicants who should have a periodic review of their income and assets might be conducted with the view to removing the ineligible applicants from the waiting list, especially those who registered when they were students and who are most likely to earn an income which will exceed the waiting list income limit after graduation. Well, I can barely accept that, but in fact, it's actually quite inhumane. but of course you're saying that the income has increased, but the income was still low when they applied. So, okay, let's say I accept that, I grant you that. But a fair and equitable principle is that if there should be a periodic review, it should apply to all applicants. And when you review income and assets, then these standards should be reasonable in light of the circumstances. I don't need a response. As I said in the beginning, your views will be reflected to the steering committee, and they will have to respond in the future. Mr. Leung Yu-zhong. Chairman, I have some single elderly applicants who have been waiting more than 2 years, almost 3 years, and they have still not received a unit. So let alone those in the 20s and 30s, the single applicants. As the Secretary said, the younger applicants will have a longer waiting time. But if you can't even solve the elderly waiting list problem, I can't expect you to solve the waiting queue, the waiting time for the younger applicants. So in your paper, it says that you say that the committee says that under the QPS, at most, there won't be more than 2,000 units for for the non-elderly single applicants. So how are you going to solve the problem? A lot of colleagues said that all the pie is fixed. You can't change the size of the pie, and if you cut it larger for one group, then another group will get less. So it's not just today's problem. This problem has been around for a few years. We just don't have enough housing. So when you worked with the Jiang Yua, Eva Chang, you had said that 15,000 units were sufficient and you could maintain a 3-year waiting period. That's what you had said. And Secretary, you said that it's not my problem. I have to get land from Lands Department to build on. But then how come you can build 20,000 units in a couple of years' time? Previously you said you don't have land, now that you have land. That's contradictory. Sometimes you have land, sometimes you don't, sometimes you build more, sometimes you build less. So can you build more or less? When can you build more? If you don't answer, there's no way we can discuss this. You'll always be limited at 15,000 units, and it seems that you have a bias. You want, if you look at the table, you say 47% of applicants are tertiary educated, 34% are students, and 33% are residents of public housing. It seems that you are denigrating these applicants. A lot of times when applicants, when they are given a unit, they can't accept because their income and assets already exceeded the threshold. You have a bias. But some young applicants, they really need housing. They live in subdivided units. How are you going to help those people? So, Chairman, I think the steering committee shouldn't just look at it from the public housing resources perspective. You should look at how you can help these young people, whether they are elderly or not. Those who need public housing, you should be catered to. So I'd like to ask the Secretary, you are just looking at it from the public housing perspective. Do you examine it outside the public housing perspective? Secretary.
First, the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee isn't looking at this with a view to the constraints on the housing supply. We haven't asked them to do that. In fact, we've said to them, look at it for what you think is the best way to look at the supply for the future. Because in 10 years or 15 or 20 years' time, which is a long-term perspective that they're taking...
Well, you're saying that it's fixed at 2,000 units and they won't change.
But when you're looking at a long-term situation, that will change. It must change.
But, well, time's up. I'm sorry. 借位權. The demand for public housing is increasing, especially for non-elderly single applicants. I think we're looking at it from a short-term perspective now. In the short term, you can apply the QPS to allot units. So I'd like to ask, just on the QPS alone, does it, aside from age, there are, when they approach the elderly level, does the waiting time reflect the supply available? And just now, colleagues mentioned, well, they might be single now, but they might want to get married. And how are these? So how would that affect their status in the QPS? And third, I want to ask, do you have figures for the cohort from 18 to 25? How many applicants are there? Because they are maybe studying, they may be in a tertiary institute. Do you have any figures indicating their income after graduation? And do they are they immediately ineligible from applying for PRH? Thank you.
Let me try and do this. The easy one, if someone's on the QPS and they get married, then of course they move on to the family application list. And their period on the QPS, it also counts to a certain extent towards their waiting time on the waiting list for the general waiting list. So there is a different status, and we consider them in that relevant context. So that's the first one. In terms of the figures of cohorts from 18 to 25, the figures we have relate up to 18 to 30, I think it is, not to 25, and perhaps Agnes can give you those figures. Yeah.
30歲以下嘅
Under 30 make up 54%, 57,600. Out of the 106,000 applicants, 54% are below 30 years of age. We see there's a trend that students apply. When students apply, there is a large change in income levels. So why don't you do some data collection on this group? Why don't you look at the 18 to 25 cohort? Just now the secretary highlighted the issue. When a person gets married, then they become a family. That's a chicken and egg relationship. So how is that reflected?
Extended chicken and egg, but their family status changes, so therefore their eligibility changes, and of course they then apply, the 3-year waiting list applies to them. In terms of research as to what the income is from 18 to 25 or 18 to 30, actually that's one of the things that we would be looking at if we were to apply the suggestion from the steering committee that we do a review of these younger people's income. And let me stress, because I think someone quite rightly made the point, that if we do a review of income, it should be across the board and not just targeting one group. So I think that our approach would be to look at all of the QPS people, not just one particular segment. I think that's important.
Kwok-hing.
This paper is very disappointing. The same officials said more than a year ago that we don't have a public housing shortage problem. But if you do some simple math, those above 35 years old, they make up 33% of applicants, some 35,000. So if you have 2,000 units every year, if we don't have aging, then they'll have to wait 17, 18 years. So even they're not an elderly person, but by the time their units are available for them, they will be elderly. That's ridiculous. 35 or above, 45 or above, their housing needs are discriminated against. The housing needs do not change according to age. If they are unable to afford Hong Kong's expensive, ridiculous housing prices, then they need public housing. This policy is discriminating them. Your figures the land supply is controlled by the government. So my first question is, those who are 45 or above 55, according to your calculations, how many years do they have to wait? Second, these single units, they need less land to build. So in other words, the same plot of land, if you build for a single person, then you can actually accommodate more single people. So let's say if you set aside 10 or 15% of land, can you turn around this inequitable single person waiting list time? And second, single person public housing land might be smaller, so housing department, a lot of non-suitable locations such as primary schools and schools can be converted. So can you increase the supply of single-person public housing to resolve this problem?
If it was a simple matter of just building more small units and I could ignore the family applicants and the other applicants, then it would be an easy solution, but I can't. I have to look after all of the applicants on the waiting list, particularly because the general waiting list applicants, we have a commitment of trying to get them their first offer within 3 years. We do not have that commitment currently under the policy.
Chairman, you have not pledged 3 years. That's the problem.
And that's one of the issues that has been a recommendation coming out of the...
Please do not respond. He's trying to answer.
This is one of the issues that the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee has been recommending. They're saying we should progressively introduce the 3-year waiting list also for people on the QPS list. That's what their recommendation is, and that's something we will refer to the Housing Authority. But at the present time, the policy does not provide for a fixed time for those people on the list. So therefore, I actually can't give you the figures that you asked for as to how long someone will wait on the QPS list. We don't record that information. And the other reason we can't provide that information is that as people come on to the list, other ages, if they come in above, say, 45 or 55, people below get forced down and have to wait longer. So it's a constantly moving situation on the QPS list.
主席，我想攞翻佢一啲書面俾翻呢，就係
Chairman, I would like to get something in writing. That is to say, the waiting time for those over 45 or over 55. And I would like to know the average waiting time of these applicants.
The QPS waiting list, we don't have that information, I'm afraid.
你年紀1歲以上都冇啊，主席。
You don't have the age profile?
Oh, but we don't have the waiting time.
唔係咁，你俾咗個45歲同55歲，我喺度對。
Dr. Kwok, please don't talk with the secretary yourself. I've asked the department to give us the information they have got. Dr. Lo Wai Kwok. Thank you, Chairman. Well, I think however much pressure we bring to bear on these officials is futile, because the reality is that we don't have the supply we need. We've been told that in the coming 5 years we're going to get 75,000 units, and now they have been able to increase that to 79,000. Well, that's a fact. And some members ask why there was no land and now you have land. But the reality is also this. In the past, the SAR government did not do a sufficiently good job in getting land reserve. And now we have to resort to various means, the use of cabins, reclamations, and so on. And it's no use to extend the coverage of our discussion. We are now talking about how we are going to allocate the PRH units we are going to get in the coming 5 years. And given this context, we should agree that priority should be given to families and elderly applicants. So now the issue is, how are we going to help as far as we can the non-elderly one-person applicants? Of course, we would like to get a bigger quota, but if we give a bigger quota to them, we have to lengthen the waiting time for families and elderly applicants. So it's a difficult balance to strike here. I have to declare my interest as a member of the Building and Tendering Committee of the HA. And as the director has said, that the pledge of average waiting time of 3 years has never been applied to the non-elderly, the one-person applicants. If some members didn't know this, I would like to put the record straight here. I think the administration should try to explore different options. For example, can we offer some youth hostels for short-term accommodation, not PRH units? In the building committee, I know that it's difficult. You have limited number of sites, and you have to build PRH units of different sizes. It's difficult to strike a balance. Therefore, in respect of non-elderly one-person applicants, the department should try to gather more information. First, for those who are under 35, we should look at the turnover rate. How many of them very quickly have income exceeding the eligibility limits? Some of them are students. According to Hong Kong U, in 2012, the average income, discounting dentists and doctors, graduates earn on average $17,000. Maybe other university graduates don't have such high income. So I'm saying that you have a graduate, very soon your income will exceed the eligibility limit. Therefore, we have 67% who are under 35. Some analysis should be conducted to know that their eligibility, the situation, so that we can have a clearer picture on the demand in the longer term. Well, we have exceeded our time limit for this item, but still, 3 members are waiting. Maybe we should reduce the time allowed. It's 3 minutes, and I can't afford a second round. Mr. Leung Kwok-hing, I won't talk about what is not achievable. Don't talk about things that you cannot achieve. Before Siwa Leung was elected, he said he wouldn't promise anything that he could not deliver. And now, according to Dr. Low Wai Kok, it cannot be done. Well, it's a lie. It's not that we cannot do anything about this. If you have rent control, people will find it easier to rent flats, and you are not willing to offer a rent allowance to people waiting. Or if it takes just 1 minute, if you make a decision to reintroduce rent control. Why are so many young people who are willing to wait? Well, I have this doggerel. When you're young, you suffer high rent. When you're old, you live in a PRH. But if you fall between two stools, then it's neither here nor there for you. So if you are young, well, you can't even get a niche in a columbarium after you die if you don't get any help. Is there no solution? Well, we have the URA under Mr. Benny Zhang. He wants to make things change. In the past, he would look at renewal projects in older districts, but not now. They ask property owners to oppose the URA and also to involve property developers to cooperate with them. So you are using the name of URH to facilitate redevelopment with the cooperation of property developers. And now he's given another 2 years term. And I've heard that there's some kind of a scandal looming. Mr. Siwa Liang has told us a big lie, talking about resolving deep-rooted problems. And one of those would be his failure to deliver. Mr. Pascott, please teach him how to address this problem of failing to deliver. Your time's up, Mr. Alan Leung. I have a question about paragraph 9. It said that the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee wants to do something about points. If you are over 35, you are going to get extra points. And also, they want to consider whether there should be criteria based on need, taking into account the specific circumstances of individual applicants. Well, this is new thinking. So my question for the Permanent Secretary is, what are being considered by the steering committee? Would they consider factors such as the applicant is about to get married, or he or she is living with parents?
As I say, these are recommendations that the steering committee has brought forth. What we will be doing is referring them to the housing authority for them to consider the detail, because at the end of the day, the final decision rests with the housing authority, not the steering committee. In terms of the particular details, the idea, I think, is that if you can allocate additional points under the quota and point system to, for example, those between 45 to 55 in the first instance, then their chance of gaining access to a unit will be increased, therefore their waiting time will be reduced. That's the thinking behind this. But of course, I think it has to be for the housing authority to take a view, because there still is this constraint on the total number of units that are going to be available. In terms of looking at the circumstances, the conditions that they're living in, they haven't come up with any specific recommendations, and I think that's quite sensible, because the housing authority, I think, should have the final decision as to what those conditions should be.
Let me ask a follow-up question. Do you have anything, any declaration in the form of direction to take from the steering committee? Age is, of course, objective. You know your age, and it's easy to know where you belong. But if you talk about individual circumstances, of course, we want to be interactive with the steering committee. Can we be told something of the thinking, the direction that they are considering?
A number of ideas. I wouldn't say recommendations at this stage. Ideas such as you should look at their, in addition to income and age, you should be looking at things like their family background. Are they from a split home or something like that? Are they divorced? Are they, do they have circumstances that would lead you to believe that their circumstances are worse than anyone else? But I have to say, they have not yet come down to specifics, because it is a very, very difficult area, and I honestly don't know the outcome of that one.
Chairman, I was thinking that in order to facilitate the interaction, if they give us more information, we can be more actively involved. All right, time is limited. Maybe you can supplement your idea with in writing. Mr. Feng, and then I'll be the last, and we have to move on to the next item. I want to talk about last but to the slide, the factors considered by the steering committee. According to the slides, the non-elderly one-person applicants who may have problem with upward mobility and who may have greater difficulty to improve their living conditions on their own. How can you define this group of applicants?
This is in the context of a discussion that members are having as to why young people predominantly seem to be applying through the quota and point system. And the thinking there was that if you look at the profile of young people, particularly the large numbers of young people that seem to be in or having received tertiary education, their opportunity to advance in terms of increasing their income, increasing their social status is far greater than people who do not have tertiary level of education. And again, the figures show that people above, I think it is 35, the numbers that have tertiary level of education is only about 7%. So that's the comparison they were taking.
主席，我想問，以前我都
Well, I used to buy this, that education would be the solution. But it doesn't seem to be the case now. Education is no solution. Even for university graduates, you can only earn something over 10,000 now. So if you look at the education attainments, a bachelor degree holder, a master degree holder, and you think that he has the ability to move upward socially, that may not be the case.
Chairman, that's one of the reasons why the recommendation is that we should actually look at what is their situation. Part of the logic behind this idea of doing a review, even before they become eligible, normally, as members know, we do the review of their income and asset just as they become eligible for allocation of a unit. But the suggestion is you should do it earlier to find out exactly what is the situation, because then that would affect the decision-making in future as to eligibility for younger people. So that's part of the thinking.
Chairman, these are two new factors which can be very subjective. I seriously disagree that these two factors be taken on board.
Chairman, that's exactly why we want to talk to members. We'll reflect that to the members.
好。現在呢就係我係作為
Well, as chairman, I would like to ask the last question. First, I'd like the administration to consider the FTU proposal that those who are eligible and not allocated a unit, they should receive a rental subsidy. Second, why do we have 33% of PRH residents? Is it because there is a well-off tenant policy and therefore they have to leave their family and apply for PRH? You have not done the statistics. I'd like you to do analysis and statistics and provide an answer. In the remaining time, I'd like to speak on behalf of a person. He has approached the complaints division of LegCo and he lodged a complaint and asked us to follow up. And finally, we have the agenda today. He would like to say that 8 years ago he was on the waiting list, and 8 years ago he had a score of 120 and he could receive a unit, but today he would need 150 points in order to get a unit. So his question is, why, as a participant in the waiting list, why is the goalpost changing? In the past it was 120 points, now it's 150 points, and he's still in the queue. Second, he also criticized, saying that he's in a queue, but there are different reasons, and there will be new additions in front of him. Of course, they have needs, but why are so many people jumping the queue? And it's never his turn. He's been waiting 8 years. There are some 100,000 applicants, and if we allot 2,000 units per year, then a person will have to wait 50 years. For non-elderly, they have to wait 35.7 years. And this is because there has been no increase in supply. So I'd like you to ask, is the goalpost always changing for this QPS?
Obviously can't comment on an individual case, but if you let me have the details, I'll try and have a look at it and reply to him directly. But let me answer in a general sense, and I'll ask Anson to supplement. The situation, as I briefly described earlier, is that people come onto the list with a certain number of points. They get extra points for every year they're on the list. However, the points are determined as much by age as by the amount of time they go on the list. That's the two criterion. And if someone comes in above them at an older age, they'll get more points. And that's the way it works. I don't know if you have time to get an explanation.
Yes, I will refer the complaints, this case from the complaints division to you, and you can provide supplemental information after the meeting. And my question is the goalpost changing? Is it not fair to the applicants? Now, we have overrun this agenda item by some 20 minutes. We cannot continue. So we'll now have to move on to agenda item number 2. That is the Housing Authority well-off tenant policy. It's CB bracket 1919-212-13 bracket 03. So on this question, I'd like the department to go through the paper, and we have to welcome Mr. Liu Ginglao for attending the meeting, and Secretary.
Take us through the PowerPoint. As members know, the Housing Authority has in place the well-off tenant policies. The logic is simple. We want to rationalise the use of public housing resources. Public rental housing tenants who have income above the limits have to pay additional rents. Those with both income and assets exceeding the relevant limits are required to vacate their units. We're well aware of the controversies over the well-off tenants policies, and for this reason the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee has had thorough discussions on this particular issue. The Steering Committee has taken note that there are actually divergent views in the community, and that there are arguments both for and against the policies. At this stage, of course, it's not something that they've come to a particular view on. They have some ideas, but nothing particular. So we welcome members' views on the well-off tenant policies, and that obviously comments on this will be collected together with those from the community in the forthcoming public consultation exercise. And let me stress, all of these views will again be referred to the Housing Authority for a final decision, because again it's a Housing Authority policy in this area. So with those very brief remarks, I can ask Anson to take us through the PowerPoint.
Yes, I'll take you through the well-off tenant policy and some of the discussions within the Long-Term Housing Strategy Committee. So when we have tenants living in PRH for 10 years, they have to declare their income and assets. If their income is above the threshold, they have to pay extra rent. And if their income is 2 to 3 times the threshold, they have to pay 1.5 times rent plus rates. If they exceed the income by 3 times, they have to pay double rent plus rates. If current tenants paying the double rent, their income will have to be reviewed every 2 years, and if it exceeds our threshold, they need to vacate the PRH. The current income levels in 2030 is it's 84 times the current threshold. There are some figures. We have 700,000 PRH tenants, and 19,000 are paying 1.5 times rent. Some 2,600 are paying 2 times rent, and we also have some tenants, 30 tenants, they are paying market rents, and they would have to vacate their units shortly. And they just make up some 3% of total PRH tenants. As the Secretary mentioned, the LTHS is aware of the community's divergent views on well-off tenant policy. Some people feel that families who wish to retain the PRH, then they might want to deregister some family members, and some people have views on this. And the government or HA, if it were to tighten the well-off tenant policy, then some tenants might be diverted to the private sector. They might either rent or purchase in the private sector, and that might lead to increase in demand. On the other hand, some people feel that there is an increase of applicants for PRH. So some people feel that we should either maintain or tighten the well-off tenant policy. And when whether should these well-off tenants vacate their unit when they exceed income and assets. Some people feel that should either income or assets exceed, they should have vacate their unit. We also have views on whether there should be a review, first review in 10 years, and whether the subsequent review should be every 2 years. The LTHS is aware of this divergent view, and therefore the HA should decide whether they need to review their policy. And lastly, we need to make reference to the well-off tenant policy, and I mentioned that the LTHS had already made discussions. So in the LTHS consultation, we will further invite the public to express their views, and ultimately these will be referred to the HA for consideration. Yes, thank you for your introduction. We now have 4 members in the queue. Anybody else wishing to speak? Please raise your hands. Let me read out the names. 梁耀忠、胡志偉、梁國雄、麥美娟、謝偉全. And I'll be the last speaker. Anybody else? So we have, let's set 4 minutes for Q&A. 梁耀忠. Referring to the document, those who come under the well-off tenant definition, out of the 700,000 tenants, there's only 20,000. That's about 3%. It's a very small number, but it has a big impact. Why? Because every 2 years, everybody needs to declare, the 700,000 tenants need to declare their assets. That brings about a lot of pressure. People are concerned if they make an error, they would be, they might be committing fraud, and their housing might be deprived. But where do they benefit? As I said, some 20,000 households are paying double rent or triple rent, but these are very few. So number of units that can be vacated are actually very minimal. So the policy incurs a lot of administrative expense, but the benefit is very minimal. And this well-off tenant policy, what are its side effects? Well, I see some large impact. It's like the LTHS concern. A lot of households, their children move out, so we have a lot of elderly estates. Well, that's one reason why estates are aging, because the young people don't want to pay double rent, triple rent, so they vacate the estate. So the estate becomes an elderly estate, and we see a lot of elderly problems. These are very difficult to resolve. Second, in our previous discussion, we talked about single-person units. So 33% of single people are PRH tenants, and the majority of them might be young people. So they don't live with their elderly family members. They join another queue for PRH. We had talked about this in the past. We're not able to release resources, and in fact, we actually add to the burden. So I'd like to ask the Secretary, your review seems to be very narrow. You're not able to identify the problem. So I'd like to ask the Secretary, will you do a more in-depth study into the well-off tenant policy on, that is, the impact on society, on households, on families, and so on?
I actually take the point entirely. This is a very difficult policy area for the Housing Authority and for the Housing Department because, unfortunately, you do have to find out information about people's income and asset limits. The logic I can understand. The logic is simple. We have a limited supply. We should encourage people who can otherwise afford to move out to move out. That's not unreasonable. I think over the last few years, where there hasn't been the home ownership scheme opportunity for people to move on, that's been more difficult. And I think that's why you have a situation where people have been very concerned that if their income or asset limit exceeds the limit, they don't really have an opportunity. But as we start the process of home ownership scheme being built, being able to give people a way through, then I think it's still appropriate to have this check to ensure that the people who deserve public rental housing most, the people who are most in need, are those that get it. And that's the logic for it.
Thank you, Chairman. The well-off tenant policy is, we have discussions on trying to tighten the well-off tenant policy, and this is very concerning. The well-off tenant policy has a lot of problems with its efficacy. We don't have HOS because there isn't a channel, there isn't another option for well-off tenants to move out. But with the cessation of HOS for 7 to 8 years, the problem is made more complex. And we also see that the income levels on the waiting list are increasing, and to a certain extent, it releases the inconvenience created by the well-off tenant policy. In the past, when we had families with 2 or 3 incomes, then we would have this problem. So I'd like to ask the Housing Department or the Secretary, as the waiting list increases, could you tell us the change in the applicants? I'd also like to remind you that at the district level,
well, I'm also asking you to proceed with caution because you demand a declaration of income, and should there be any mistake, then there's the problem of making a misrepresentation, or that may lead to the tenancy cancellation of the tenants concerned. And if it's elderly tenant who's filling in the form, then he or she may not have all the information needed. So I hope you can deal with cases of so-called false declarations carefully. The more advice should be given to them on how to complete the forms.
A lot of care to make sure that we don't overreact in situations like that. We do actually try to help people to make sure that they do provide the information, that they know what they have to provide, and we check on that. And I think that the fact that we only have, I think it's 30, currently 30 tenants that are subject to the notice to quit because of being exceeding both income and asset shows that we're actually very careful on this. In addition to that, of course, we do have an appeal mechanism so that if people feel that the reason they've been given these notices to quit is unreasonable for whatever reason, they can appeal to the independent appeal panel and they will take a look at these cases. So I want to assure members that while the system is in place, and I think it's right that it has to be there.
主席，我淨係提一提啫，我希望嗰個係上。
I just want to put in a reminder that you should allow the tenant concerned to rectify mistakes in the appeal mechanism, be lenient to them.
We do have a dialogue with them. If there is a particular problem, we always check the information. It isn't just based on the declaration of the.
我見到就好似好死咁樣樣咯，希望喺呢一。
From what I've learned, it seems to be rather rigid. I hope you will not be putting too much pressure on the tenants.
留意梁國。
That's just a comment. Mr. Kwok-hing, I live in a PRH unit as the only member who is living in a PRH. I've been attacked by fellow members. I don't mind. Well, there's the system for declaration. If I live in a PRH unit by breaking the law, I will be in jail. Well, these electrical members attack me without regard to social implications. Well, the well-off tenants policies were introduced because back then you provided a ladder for people to move up so that you can have more units to reuse. But what about now? No HOS. Are you saying that they should buy in the private market? And now people reacted by having some family members joining the waiting list. And you have this factor of 84 times the limit. I don't know how this is arrived at. Maybe you are talking about the ability to pay a down payment. But what about mortgage payment? So what do you suggest? What do you presume? Are they going to buy the HOS or a private flat or a sandwich glass flat when you decide on the factor of 84? Well, if you don't have sufficient supply of PRH, these people, and after these people move out, they may have to move to subdivided flats, and you may accommodate some other people who used to live in subdivided flats. So the PRH unit is occupied by a previous subdivided flat tenant, and the previous tenant now becomes a subdivided flat tenant. Well, if I buy an HOS, 500 square feet, which can accommodate a family, and a single person, occupies the HOS, that's not regarded as a waste of resources? So why don't you provide a ladder with different rungs that correspond to different income levels? Well, in my housing estate, the tenants are either elderly people or new immigrants. And now you have policy to encourage children to live in a nearby unit. Well, I don't want to repeat all this. I'm approaching 60. I should be eligible for an elderly home, but you are not going to drive me out. And I welcome checks on my assets. I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about the splitted family, the fact that the young family members of PRH tenants are coerced into joining the waiting list again. Well, I hope you officials will consider our difficulties. I hope Mr. Ng Leung Sing will hear what I have to say here. Miss Alice Mack, well, maybe my language competency is not very high. If the well-off policies, well-off tenants policies are related to the long-term housing strategy, then what is not? It's just a few percent of PRH tenants that we're talking about. Is the steering committee suffering from a lack of sufficient workload? The steering committee should be looking at the long-term strategy, the supply, the number of units, rather than looking at the system that would apply to 20,000 tenants only. If this is also part of our long-term strategy, then I would say that the steering committee has too little to work on. We have to make the best use of our PRH units and help those in need. The well-off tenants policies were devised to encourage recirculation. Back then we had HOS, and now we are starting to get some HOS units in the coming years. The steering committee should be looking at things that would encourage mobility. For example, ways and means to increase the supply of HOS, more land supply for HOS, and also how can construction and building be expedited to provide more HOS units instead of trying to make things difficult for these 20,000 tenants. Where can they go if they are evicted? Are they going to move to subdivided flats, or as the Secretary puts it, nicely divided flats? We have to ensure that public housing resources are given to those genuinely in need. But to encourage mobility, the well-off tenants policies are no good. We should try to make sure that people get decent accommodation. So are you saying that these well-off tenants should be evicted and they would end up in subdivided flats? You have contradictory measures. You want to achieve aging in place, and you want to encourage children to take care of the old parents, and yet you have the well-off tenants policies that have the effect of driving out young people from the PRH. So I hope the steering committee would really look at long-term housing strategy and how we can achieve mobility.
This is just one of many issues that the steering committee is looking at. But it is actually quite an important issue because at the end of the day, one of the aspects that we need to look at is the rational use of those resources we already have. And, you know, we come across instances where people actually own property. They own residential property. The question, therefore, is why are they then living in public rental housing estates? I think it's entirely rational for us to be looking and asking those questions so that those people who don't need to live in public rental housing move out, move into their own accommodation, and then people who really do need to move in, move in. Having said that, of course, as you can see from the figures, it is by far the minimum that we can do. We're not pushing this as an aggressive policy, it's a proportionate policy in the circumstances.
接住係副主席謝偉銓議員。
Deputy Chairman, Mr. Tony Jay. We are told that more than 200,000 people are waiting for PLH, and we'll be talking about rational utilization of resources to those genuinely in need. And in this context, I think we need to maintain the well-off tenants policies. But at the same time, the steering committee on LTHS should also take a look at the criteria. These well-off tenants must be given an opportunity to move up the ladder, the housing ladder. Then there's a need for a long-term housing strategy. The recent development, Greenview Villa, tells us that green farmers had lower interest than white farmers. Is it because the progression ladder seems unattractive to them? So we are told that there will be HOS, but are the HOS units appropriate and attractive? Has there been any problem with the income levels and affordability? Maybe the ladder is one with rungs too far apart for them to progress, and then there are people who work on the mainland. Do you take into account the income of these talents, and has there been any difficulty in taking into account their income?
Mr. Chairman, this issue of a ladder, I think, is relevant because up until the announcement in 2011 of the reintroduction of HOS, it was, I think, not impossible for people to find relatively cheap flats. You could find $1–2 million flats, but they were in remote locations. And it doesn't necessarily mean that people would be prepared to move out to those units. By introducing the HOS, I think the ladder is reinstated. Of course, it takes a little bit of time for us to get the program up to full speed. But the recent sale of Greenview Villa and the sale currently underway of the surplus HOS from the Housing Authority show that there is genuine interest from green farmers. But of course, they will always look at their individual circumstances. We don't have the ability to force people out, but we must encourage them. And I think using the well-off tenant policy is a good way to encourage people to move out, because they then move into a situation where they get permanent accommodation. They're not subject to future reviews on their income or asset limits, and therefore, I think as the home ownership scheme projects start to kick in a bigger number, 17,000 and thereafter 5,000, then the ladder becomes even more obvious for those people in the public rental housing levels. In terms of looking at the criteria, which is the other point you made, I think that's quite right, but I think it's for the Housing Authority to look at that, because at the end of the day, it's the Housing Authority that must change the policy in order to better reflect the situation, but we will reflect that to them.
好，接住係田北辰議員。
Mr. Michael Tian. Thank you, Chairman. I agree with that the housing policy lacks supply, and therefore HOS tenants they find it difficult to relocate. But it takes time for more land supply to come on stream and more PRH to be available. But currently, I agree with having the well-off tenant policy. Not only agreeing with it, but even though we don't have a lot of well-off tenants, but when they cross the income and means assets threshold, then they're given 12 millions. they are given 12 months notice to vacate. I think out of fairness, it has to be done. Otherwise, it would be a joke. But I also mentioned, do we lack turnover? In the private HOS market, when all premiums are paid, I mentioned last occasion, in Meifu we have Qinglai unit, in Satin we have Hobunfa unit, 500 square foot units going for 3 million. Everything's included in the 3 million price. 70% mortgage, 900,000 down payment, and then every month you're paying a mortgage of 11,000. Look at the income threshold; it's more than 900,000. Why do we have such a high threshold before they are told to go find housing in the private market? But we have transactions at this level. But 11,000 mortgage, and the income limit is 40,000, 50,000. So I had asked the secretary on the last occasion, the number of well-off tenants, why is it so lax? We now see a downturn in the private sector, and yet we're increasing the income threshold. I'd like to know today, these people, these well-off tenants, they can afford HOS housing. Why do we still have such lax thresholds?
I think the thresholds are reasonable in the circumstances. You don't look at it just in terms of one particular point in time. These are situations that do change over time. And as the Honourable Member knows, the last few years, well, we haven't really had HOS, we haven't really had an alternative. The cost of getting into private housing is relatively very, very high. The question, I think, which he's asking, and I think it's quite reasonable, is should that still be the case? Should it still be set at 84 times? Should it still be set at exceeding the income threshold? Those are the things that I would expect the Housing Authority to look at when this is referred to them for consideration. Because clearly we want the policy to be in step with the current situation, both in the market and in the society.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah.
The numbers that I quoted as an all-time high, this is based on recent transaction figures. And everybody know recently the land prices is historical high. So either in the past or in the future, I don't see that we should make provision for anything worse than what we have now. I'm just simply arguing that these numbers, I don't know where they come from, the 84 times, I agree with you. So I'm actually addressing the issue of the 84 times.
As I said, I think that's something the Housing Authority will have to look at. Because when you do a review, you look at all aspects of it, how it's applied.
When will the review be done?
Yes, they will consider this problem. So, Mr. Kwok-hing, are you ready? Yes? I would like to ask a specific question. First of all, the well-off tenants, I can see it's only 3% that are well-off. So a more reasonable approach would be whether they have exceeded income or assets, they should vacate. We should actually encourage them to purchase their PRH or purchase HOS. If you just drive them away, it doesn't solve the problem. It just creates more frustration in society. So, even though we don't have a lot of well tenants, but in order to encourage them, that is 3 times the income or 84 times, could you have them become potential HOS tenants? And I agree with, if they are willing, they should vacate the PRH so more people can use it. In 02, the HOS pricing, and compare that with today's prices, we have ridiculously high prices today. So could you tell us, if you use the average sale price, the 84 times income limit should be adjusted to more than 100 times? Because when you ask them to vacate PRH, it's quite a drastic measure, because we do have astronomical prices in the private market. It's quite hard to sustain. Two questions.
First one, I think it's correct to say that if there is a proper ladder that people can move into, that's what we should be encouraging to do. So I don't disagree with you that if we have an HOS sales program ongoing and not periodic as it is at the moment, that's the obvious way for us to encourage them to move out. So I would certainly agree with that. In the meantime, there are already opportunities for people to move into HOS through the secondary market, because as you know, HOS owners in the secondary market who don't wish to pay premium can sell to green form tenants without paying the premium. So that opportunity already exists, and indeed I would expect people to look at that as their first option. But some people, as I said before, the 84 times limit is not, that's the minimum. There are people that we come across that have much, much more than that. Some already own properties. So you have to look at the individual circumstances of those people that are caught out. The second issue about HOS pricing, there is a pricing methodology. I don't think we have enough time to get into that right here. But basically, we look at the market rates within the location of the units to be disposed of. We then look at the affordability of the potential tenants within the market, and then we take a view. It's exactly the same methodology as would apply in 2002 as it applies today. And I think it sets it according to affordability. That's the key issue. The absolute price and rate will vary because of the location, floor, etc.
好，而家咧就我作為最後一位議員咧。
I'll ask the last question. Two. First, will the administration reactivate tenant purchase scheme? Because aside from HOS being an option, so for those who can afford it but can't afford private housing, they can purchase their own PRH. So will the government review this? That's the first question, TPS. Second, relating to our previous agenda item, we saw that the non-elderly single applicants, some 33% are from PRH residents. So has the administration done analysis? How many of these applicants are from well-off tenants? We see a lot of well-off tenants. In order to retain their unit, they ask their children to leave or apply for PRH. So we have this undesired effect. So have you analyzed, out of the 33%, how many of them are from well-off tenants? Two questions.
Mr. Chairman, I have to be direct. We have really no plans to reactivate the tenant purchase scheme. As far as the department is concerned, it's actually a very difficult scheme for us to administer. And there are many problems that have arisen: management problems, control problems, disputes between the rental units within the TPS estates and the ownership units, disputes involving the owners' corporation. So we don't have any plans to reactivate that policy. On the second one, looking at the non-elderly applicants and what analysis we do, perhaps Anson could comment on that for you.
黎生，
係主席，咁就
In our previous item, according to HA 2012 waiting list survey, for 35 years of age applicants, 33% are PRH residents. This is just a survey. It's just also to ensure that we also want to ensure their privacy and confidentiality, so we cannot confirm the 33% of applicants whether they are well-off tenants or non-well-off tenants. Let me respond to the second question. Since you don't have source analysis on 33% tenants application, so when you try to devise strategy, it is more ambiguous and difficult to find a solution. Now, even though you can't respond to my question, but I personally hope that the administration and LTHS committee conduct further investigation and analysis. Regarding the first question, the Secretary has once again denied that TPS would be revived, and I would like to express my strong displeasure. And it's almost 4:30 now. We don't have any AOB, so we conclude today's meeting. Thank you very much.